The first question is, why do people start gambling? We have a tendency, particularly when we're younger, to be drawn to things that look exciting and fun. And that's part of the brain activity, is our brain lights up and we say, oh, that looks shiny. Whether we engage in that shininess or over-engage in it is actually on how much rewards we feel about engaging in it versus inhibition control, how much part of our brain says, ooh, this might be scary. So that fundamental step of taking risks and understanding what is and what isn't scary is a lot about why people start taking risks. Now, why do they gamble specifically? Why do they buy lottery tickets or whatever it may be? Most people start by gambling with their families or their friends. We know that most people will gamble, particularly men will gamble before they reach the age of 21. Why? Gambling in some way, engaging in risks in some way is exhilarating. No one jumps out of a plane for the first time and doesn't tell 100 people about it in the next week. And the reason is that exhilaration was fun. So that's why people start gambling. Now, why do people move from gambling for fun and then some of those individuals start to have real significant problems? We know that impulsivity does play part of it. But I think if there's any common theme, it's that the fun is a relief and a reward in life, and that the harms that occur are something that people push off or wish would go away. We once treated an individual, for example, who was kind of a shy guy. And whenever he had to present in front of a group of people, he would reward himself by going to the casino immediately afterwards. Or we have had people who have experienced the death of somebody important in their life, and they don't want to deal with everybody talking about that person. But guess what? They can go to the casino, find some friends, hang out, have a great day, and next thing you know, they're gambling in a way that causes harm. And I want to emphasize there, this is not an issue of self-control. I believe most human beings have moderate to good self-control depending on the situation. It is really about when you bring those skills to bear to something that it happens to be a weakness of yours. Gambling in the United States has seemed to evolve very quickly over the last 30 years, but took a huge jump following the Supreme Court decision allowing states to regulate sports wagering. And many states were actually prepared even before that decision to legalize it. So the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen 30-some states now have sports wagering as a legal option, and there are more states that are about to legalizing it. So we've had this explosion where we went from a trip to a drive to now you reach for your phone. And that makes it different, and it also makes it scary for some people. And there are reasons to pay attention that harms may increase. I don't think the sky's falling yet, but I do think there's inclement weather. And I say particularly inclement weather because the other element that people aren't paying attention to is that Nevada has worked on gaming laws forever, New Jersey for a long time, but most jurisdictions have yet to appropriately fund both research as well as the regulatory mechanisms to create safety nets that help people. In fact, there's a whole world in the gambling space that's called responsible gambling. The idea of responsible gambling is to help populations that we know are more likely to be at risk, to prevent harm where we can, and to decrease both the incidence and prevalence of gambling problems by effectively maturing treatments to help people. That is dependent on gambling regulators, meaning governments, and the industry looking towards the research and say, what is the evidence for the best way to move forward? Which means both of those groups need to invest in the research. One of the things that gambling regulators should pay attention to is how we should look at the role of professional leagues, and in some ways even universities, in offering sports wagering. They need to be, one, identified as now part of the industry. The NFL, the NBA, et cetera, they are gaming companies now. What I'm not sure about is what policies and procedures they've adopted to ensure that their consumers have the adequate protections. That's key to this whole idea of responsible gambling. It's incumbent on any player in this market to say, as a business, what is my social responsibility If I'm adding these ads to the billboards, if I'm having commentators speak constantly about what bet might be coming up, what's the effect of doing that? How do I mitigate the harms that may occur and live up to the trust that my consumer has in me? People love the NFL and they trust them. You trust that the owners of the various teams are doing the right thing, even though we know that they have lots of reasons to get in this game, but we have to hold them accountable for that social responsibility. It's a really interesting question about how do we really think about gambling problems and gambling disorders from a psychiatric or psychological perspective. From the psychiatric perspective, for a long time, they thought about it as an impulse control disorder, sort of like people who have a tendency to set fires. The evolution to thinking about it as an addiction, which from the lay perspective, you can say, gee, this was evident a long time ago, was this issue that addiction involves a substance. And how do we start thinking about a behavior without a substance, like gambling, as the same thing as alcohol or opioids or nicotine? And what really convinced the American Psychiatric Association to now conceptualize it as an addiction was the evidence of what areas of the brain it activates when presented with cues. So it sort of suggested that neurologically or neuropsychologically, the pathways may be the same. And so maybe we need to link them together. There's still a lot of resistance to that because it's like, it's an addiction without a substance. So what's that like? As a psychologist, as opposed to a psychiatrist, I don't struggle with that same problem. It really boils down to, it's a problem for people if in fact they engage in a behavior, that behavior causes significant harm, yet they continue to engage in that behavior. And then that harm doesn't get addressed, but instead escalates and progresses. And when that occurs, I think that's when we think about it as being a problem. I just saw somebody saying, gambling's just as addictive as heroin. Well, it's a little different. Heroin can produce permanent damage. It can lead to death. But I think there are lots of little nuances that we're only beginning to understand. So just to give you one simple example, no one goes out drinking for the night thinking that they're going to wake up the next morning and all their problems are going to be solved. No one does. No matter if you just have one or two drinks or you have more drinks than you really ought to have and you black out, you don't think you're going to wake up and the world's going to be taken care of. Gamblers believe that. Gamblers, it's hard for them to escape the idea that I could end the night and all of my problems are going to be solved. And now to bring that into everyone's experience, because we all get the idea, what would it be like to win hundreds of millions or $1 billion in one of those lottery tickets? We all get that. It's hard to escape it. But what happens for the person who gambles and has problems because of that gambling, they're in the hole. They're realizing financial distress. There are people in their lives are angry with them where they feel like they need to escape their lives. And being focused in on this hope that I might solve all my problems tonight or tomorrow is similar to what we all think about with a mega million payout, but at a much more modest level of expectations. The basis of all the questions that people have about what's going on, why aren't people seeking treatment, et cetera, really, I think, boils down to two issues. One is we really haven't paid attention to gambling until the last 20 years. So the comfort in the culture that understand that the person who gambles and has harm is like a person who drinks and has harm is just decades behind. As a result of that, gambling is really highly stigmatized. Addictions are more highly stigmatized than are other mental health issues. I recently saw a study that reported that about 90% of the people who experience a major depressive episode seek treatment, while the question is how many gamblers who are experiencing a diagnostic symptom seek treatment. And our best evidence suggests that it's only 1 out of 10. And that in part is everybody knows that if I tell you I'm depressed, your response is to give me empathy and want to provide me supports or point in the right direction. But if I tell you I have a problem with my gambling, the response you're going to get is you just need to buck up. You just need to do better. So there's not the empathy, but rather an attack and blaming the person for having it. So that's what that stigma is. The second thing is that there are just not a lot of people that know how to treat gambling. We're at the very early stages of understanding what is the best methods to treat it and how to make those available to people. And we have this huge barrier in that, at least in the United States, the federal government does not fund the treatment of gambling. So the really high quality studies can't be done without that funding. But with that said, we kind of know that very brief interventions, one session, online, little online things, if people complete them, there's a good chance they're going to get a modest, but a real solid nudge in changing their behavior and maybe decreasing their symptoms that are related to the gambling problem. But we also know that individual therapy works pretty well. In fact, it works about as well as treatments for other addictions, which is a significant increase. What's referred to as cognitive behavioral interventions have the strongest evidence and can produce a significant change in both symptoms and behavior, and that it looks like that gets maintained for at least 6 months to 9 months after treatment. So we do know there's a treatment available out there. More people need to learn those skills and learn how to bring them into bear on the individual therapy that they do. But we're not going to make any progress in answering really important questions if we don't have, it just requires research, and that requires money to do research.